Hello and welcome to my AIS AT2 presentation on non-communicable diseases. Non-communicable diseases are a scourge of the present. These prevalent and eminently preventable conditions significantly contribute to Australia's burden of disease, causing premature death and a decreased quality of life. In this presentation, we will briefly explore NCDs and their determinants before focusing on the mental health of queer youth in Australia, and how this relates to my professional life as a primary school teacher, and to my planned research on how children's sex, gender, sexual identities are impacted by discourses of biopower in Australian primary school communities. The World Health Organization explains that, unlike infectious diseases, NCDs are not passed from person to person by pathogenic organisms. They generally have a slow progression and last for a long time. The top 5 are cancer, cardiovascular disease, chronic respiratory disease, diabetes, and mental illness. NCDs have common behavioural and metabolic risk factors, which increases the probability of NCD comorbidity. They also share complex, interrelated determinants and exist with these in a circular relationship. For example, socioeconomic development both determines and is determined by NCD prevalence. This is evident in the disproportionate impact of NCDs in low to middle income countries. Having introduced NCDs in general, let us focus now on mental health in queer Australian youth. The literature shows that queer youth's mental health is negatively impacted by a network of determinants, of which socio-cultural factors are posited as the most influential. But what causes these factors? If we search upstream from them, we find they are produced by harmful and pervasive heteronormativity. This assumption and privileging of heterosexuality interacts with other social forces that influence queer people's collective and individual health and well-being, as Leonard et al. Describe in the Private Lives 2 report. Queer Australians experience significantly poorer mental health outcomes than the general population. For example, they have higher K-10 scores and much lower SF36 scores, particularly in the case of youth. This is mainly due to the discrimination and exclusion they experience as a result of heteronormativity. And discrimination and exclusion form a vicious circle with mental illness, both increasing and being increased by it. This also increases risk of other NCDs. Within the queer population, youth are disproportionately affected by mental illness, as I briefly explained before. This mirrors general population trends, which show that mental illness and suicidality are the greatest burden of disease in Australian youth. In the queer youth population, the trend might also be due to the additional impact of socio-cultural factors on children and adolescents who may lack resilience and knowledge of and access to positive coping mechanisms. People identifying as trans and or bisexual are also much more likely to experience mental illness. A possible reason for this is because they are more likely to have experienced heterosexist violence, bullying, harassment, and abuse. So far, we've seen that sex, gender, sexual identities are a predictor of mental health. People with identities that resist the heterosexual matrix are far more likely to experience psychological distress, mental illness, and suicidality. This is exacerbated in queer youth and in people with trans and or bisexual identities in particular. Stigma, discrimination, exclusion, bullying, harassment, abuse, and violence are key determinants of queer youth mental health and are socio-culturally constructed through the operation of heteronormativity. Discourses of heteronormativity operate in primary schools to construct children's sex, gender, sexual identities in a biopower binary of straight as self and queer as other. The impact of heteronormativity on queer youth's mental health is therefore highly relevant to my professional life as a primary school teacher and to my research on how children's sex, gender, sexual identities are impacted by discourses of biopower in Australian primary school communities. I've identified 4 main implications for my research and practice, and we'll look at those now. First, the heteronormativity mental health link validates my personal pedagogy and practice. As a teacher, I have a legal duty of care to protect against reasonably foreseeable harm. Since I can reasonably foresee that heteronormativity might cause harm to queer children's mental health, it is my responsibility to minimise risk of this harm by addressing each and every instance of heterosexist bullying, harassment, abuse and violence, by interrupting heteronorms, and by advocating for safe spaces for queer youth at school. Drawing on Antonovsky's salutogenic model of health promotion, minimising harm conceivably includes maximising well-being. As such, I have a duty to affirm queer youth identity, to advocate for not just safe, but celebratory spaces. I do try to do this in my practice, but having a body of literature demonstrating the link between heteronormativity and mental illness in queer youth provides validation for me and justification for others, which is sadly all too often needed. The heteronormativity mental health relationship strengthens justification for my planned master's and PhD theses. Data from the Writing Themselves In surveys demonstrate that children who perceive their school as supportive are less likely to harm themselves or attempt suicide. These data also consistently show over many years that school is the most likely place for verbal and physical abuse of queer children. Teachers are duty-bound to protect against harmful spaces and dispositions, and therefore, as Wofford argues, and I strongly agree, it is neither ethical nor professional to fail to prepare them to queer their practice. If my research can demonstrate the need for teachers to be prepared to teach queerly, as I hope my PhD thesis will start to show, and the lack of this type of preparation in Australian university courses, as I think my master's thesis might demonstrate in terms of La Trobe, then it might lend momentum to the call for queer policies and pedagogies in tertiary institutions and, ultimately, positively impact queer children's mental health in Australia. As a beginner researcher in a sensitive field, I am very concerned about getting ethics approval. Referring to data on queer Australian youth's mental health in relation to heteronormativity and school experiences will strengthen justification for my projects, particularly when these data are taken in conjunction with those on the link between mental illness and risk factors for other NCDs. The increased prevalence of psychological distress, mental illness and suicidality in people identifying as trans and or bisexual has made me reflect on whether I ought to narrow my field of interest from LGBTIQ identities in general to trans and bisexual identities in particular. I think I would like to get a broad view of the lived experiences of queer youth, but surely within this, and over a planned remaining lifetime of academic pursuit, there is space for projects focused solely on trans and bisexual populations. For example, on the advice of a Tasmanian queer youth advocate, I am keen to investigate the use of illegal online hormones by desperate trans teens in Tasmania as my minor thesis next semester. Finally, the link between heteronormativity and queer Australian youth's mental health has ramifications for my research in that it makes me question whether my approach might reinforce queer youth's position as other. By focusing on harm, am I actually perpetuating it? In their From Blues to Rainbows report into the mental health and wellbeing of gender diverse and trans Australian youth, the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society took an explicitly strengths-based approach. Is this what I ought to be doing? Reflecting on this, I contacted Queer Youth of Tasmania to explore their perspective on how community groups improve queer youth's mental health. Co-founder Finian Danger explained that providing queer youth with a safe social space broadens their support, enabling them to feel less isolated and alone and leading to huge changes in their mental health. What really stuck with me from our conversation was his statement that we exist to fill the gaps in our community that young LGBTI people desperately need. Perhaps my research should focus less on the negative space of the gap and more on the positive space of that which might fill it. In conclusion then, mental illness is a central player in the scourge of NCDs. It's harmful in and of itself, but is also linked with greater occurrence of risk factors for other NCDs. Mental illness disproportionately affects queer Australians and impacts queer youth and people with trans and bisexual identities in particular. It is primarily socio-culturally determined, with heteronormativity causing key risk factors such as stigma, discrimination and exclusion, and fear and experiences of bullying, harassment, abuse, and violence. The heteronormativity mental illness link is relevant to and has significant implications for my research and practice. It validates my pedagogy as a teacher and strengthens justification for my PhD and master's theses. However, it makes me wonder if my planned projects might unintentionally reinforce queer as other, and if I should be focusing more on trans and bisexual identities. You have heard what I have to say on this, but let us end here with a young queer Australian speaking for herself.
Hi, my name's Marley. I'm 16 and I go to school in inner city Melbourne. So, in a world where there was no discrimination against, sexuality, gender, I'd feel comfortable. I assume everyone would feel comfortable. And there'd be no fear in just being who you are. Everyone would just be happy. There wouldn't be kids being kicked out of home. There wouldn't be people at work too scared to talk about their home life at work. It'd be a world without fear, and a world where everyone felt loved.